I'm extremely delighted to have the chance to talk with Calvin Baker tonight about his new book, A More Perfect Reunion. Until this moment, Calvin was best known as a novelist. He's written 4 novels, the first one of which came out at the extremely youthful moment of 24 years of age. It was hailed as brilliant. His books are, to me, their signature characteristic is that he develops a very powerful and lyrical internal voice through which you slowly apprehend the truths of the world around him. And this voice can often, in his books, move among different characters in ways that are very subtle and complex, and that draw on the modernist tradition of Woolf and Joyce, but also on a lot of kind of colloquial language and contemporary experience. So they're very special novels. We're not going to talk anything more about them tonight, but I do encourage you to read them. And he now most recently has written a book of nonfiction called A More Perfect Union, Race, Integration, and the Future of America, which I'm seeing is backwards, but I don't know if you see it. And Calvin, Calvin kindly said he would read a little bit of it before we started talking.
Well, thank you. And isn't Zoom just the end of the world? But it has the virtue of bringing us all together. I've said this behind Ann Kjellberg's back, and I'll say it to her face. She's one of the best minds for literature I've ever encountered. I've read her book post, and she is, I can't say enough about what a great editor and what a subtle editor she is. And for those of you who aren't in North Carolina, Malaprop is the place to be. I'm going to read very briefly from A More Perfect Reunion. And the only things you need to know ahead of this, the White Lion was the very first slave ship to arrive in this country, and it wasn't properly a slave ship as we think of them. It was an English vessel that had captured a Portuguese ship bound for Mexico with a cargo that contained a number of Angolans, and the English captured this ship and sold the cargo ashore in Virginia in order to provision herself for the journey home to Leeds, I believe it was, or I'm sorry, to Liverpool. So the White Lion is the first slave ship to land in America. This chapter, the page I'm going to read from is from the second chapter of the book, entitled The Toll of Independence, and it's about the founding generation, and including the framers of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. I'll read very briefly because I'm eager for this conversation. All of them, meaning the founders, like us, sincerely believed one thing, but faced a fundamental, perfectly relatable question. How do I free myself? Or for those of religious feeling, how do I free myself from sin? I believe they thought the best of the human spirit and the principles of revolution were so powerful that once they were free of England, slavery was bound to fall in due order, because the American, indeed universal, feeling for freedom was so strong. They saw themselves as making a temporary compromise in the name of practicality, which they hoped to later revise. George Mason, who wrote the Bill of Rights, is on record as wanting to bar the South from the Union. The majority were convinced of the necessity of a united front in the face of England's superior force. They were anything but cynical, though there were certainly cynics and opportunists in their ranks, and many had the usual amount of self-deceit. I think they underestimated the extent to which racism had shaped them, as well as the forces of greed and power arrayed on the other side. And after taking a bite of the apple, soon learned they'd swallowed the devil. They were overly optimistic, and they underestimated the darkness. Of course, by then, the darkness was internal and rooted deep, especially for men like Jefferson, for whom the anguish of race was not merely political, but personal as well. Their challenge, like our own, was to escape the legacy systems that produced them and the forces within the new country that continue to actively support those systems. Slavery and white supremacy, as the good people in Northampton County in the early 17th century demonstrate, were anything but a predetermined course for America, even after the White Lion brought her cargo ashore.
Wow, that was beautifully read. I was going to ask you a different question, but now you've prompted me to ask something else, which is thinking about the founders. It's become in recent months such a contested territory. Was laying out an understanding of the founders an important part of framing your argument or setting up your goal for what you had to say about integration?
Thank you, Anne. I think that it was, because when we talk about the founders, right, we talk first of all about a monolith, and we say they all believe these things, and it was like any kind of committee. You've got a bunch of lawyers and business folk in a room, and these people want this, and these people want this, and these people want that. John Quincy Adams, who I talk about here, is on record, and he was the son of the second president, and he was the first president from the generation after founding. And he says in a speech in Massachusetts, none of the people we think about, even the Southerners, believed in slavery. They felt it was something that they'd been saddled with by England. And when we talk about, and the reason I want to go back, and I've written about the colonial generations a couple of times, the first in Dominion, the second time I wrote a piece for Harper's a number of years ago about the legacy of Obama. And I've been turning this around, and I think it's important that we understand some of the nuance, A, like that there was conflict, but B, this isn't what they believed in their hearts and in their conscience. But like all of us, things that they believed ran into the faces and forces of reality and the society that they're in. And when we talk about the spirit of America, when we talk about the spirit of revolution, it's really important, I think, for those of us on the left to claim that legacy and claim it proudly, as opposed to and this is the argument that comes from Simon Schama that's now been popularized, and everyone says like, oh, America exists because of slavery. And there's some truth to that, to the extent that slavery was on the wane in England, and some of the large planters would only join the revolution if slavery was guaranteed for them. But it's nowhere in the constitutional document, and one bends over backwards to write it out, right? So you never ever see that word, persons who've been bonded, and so on and so forth. So there are all these complex locutions to keep the word out, because we're not going to sign anything that has slavery in it. And so when we say now, like, oh, well, America's only about slavery and only about race, that's a lie. It is, in its spirit, about democracy, and this Kantian notion of democracy as this powerful force that bends toward freedom and that's going to encompass the world. And it's really idealistic, according to our best evidence. And so I want to frame that, because it was important for me to claim that legacy for the arguments that I'm making about this current moment.
Yeah, there's one, I was really struck reading the book that there's a lot of imaginative sympathy for them, or and you see the novelist at work here, a willingness to enter into, especially Jefferson, whose situation seems so indescribable. And then you also have a section on Othello, where you enter in imaginatively to the Renaissance understanding of Blackness. And it's an excellent setup for what's to come. So the next question I wanted to ask you was, when you decided to write a work of nonfiction, it seems that there was something that you felt was really missing from the discourse that you wanted to bring forward. And I just wonder if you could try to put in a kernel what that is. What does your book argue for that's not out there otherwise?
Okay, so this is, it's deeply personal, and I turned to nonfiction because you can say things directly in nonfiction in ways that you can't in fiction, at least not the kinds of fiction that I like, right? You don't want fiction to be overcome with ideology, but I've written about American history and I've thought about it for a long time. First, with this question, what is my country? And I've written about America as a space that's always been multicultural on contested terms. And the questions I've been exploring are how do you decolonize the interior? How do you center, in my case, a Black self? It could be a Native American self. It could be a female self, any kind of self that's been written out. How do you center that without making special arguments, without special pleading? And what I believe, and believe firmly, is that the real arc of freedom in this country points to integration. And this is something that many early observers in the colonial era were aware of, that people like Frederick Douglass was aware of, and Abe Lincoln late in life, and Du Bois, and the civil rights movement that we know of. It's about full participation. And we've come to this point, it felt to me, where the bar was so low, and it's just, well, not saying the wrong words, but the entire space around you, everything that you're participating in is reinforcing colonial constructions. And so if you're inside of a burning house, you can say it's not burning, or you can talk about putting it out for as long as you want, but unless you're acting, the house is still going to burn down. And I wanted to talk about what it means to actively decolonize space, mental spaces, physical spaces, and not simply, I don't want to pick on any books, but things like white fragility, because things like that, or how to be an anti-racist, those things do people a service. If you've never thought about these things and you're over here and you're just thinking about it, well, that's great. But the real conversation, the business end of the table is over here. And that was getting left behind. And so I wanted to speak to it directly.
Yeah, I feel like you bring up a couple of kind of racial exercises that we put ourselves through in the absence of really accomplishing integration. So you talk kind of about white fragility and addressing internal consciousness, or sort of diversity and bringing forward the exemplary Black person, and not really confronting the systemic absence of Black people, from all layers of the society. It's almost as though it's not as though these efforts in themselves are bad, but they're a distraction, or they can be a kind of a sop to keep us from addressing the deeper.
Well, that's right. And because we talk about, right, diversity has become a commercial, it's become representational as opposed to action. And so it's fine. It's wonderful to have a Black president, but if you've got tens of million Black people and 100 million people of all races and backgrounds living in poverty, well, you have to discount what this means, or you have to put this on this side of the scale and these tens of millions of people on the other side of the scale. And you say, well, we have nothing to congratulate ourselves for, but work to do. And with that, and just another mental exercise, just the way that I grew up, my best one, like of my best friends, one is, one is an Austrian, one is like Irish Puerto Rican, and one is a Taiwanese guy. I don't get special credit for that. Right, we're the same like weird kind of dude with like the same weird kind, and we just happened to meet each other when we were kids. And those you're like, I don't get to say like, oh, my best friend is Chinese or Taiwanese, and so I understand this. It doesn't count for anything. That's my private life. And when we talk about the public sphere, I can say, okay, well, you're right, this may be so for me or a few people, but does nothing to erase like the structures of colonialism that we still live within, that we take part within on massive scales. And these are physical spaces, right? So you ask yourself, and so I focus on integration because you can't get away from it. You walk into a restaurant and you say, why does everybody here look a certain kind of way? And even in places, right, like in New York, you're like, oh, everybody lives in Brooklyn or everybody lives in New York City. And you walk into space, like, why is everybody in this restaurant white at lunchtime? And you can't get away from it. It's like, oh, I'm participating in this colonial construct. And whatever I say I believe, I'm sitting here, spending my money this way, supporting this construct. So that's the real bar or barrier for me. It's like, what does it take to make that space look like a representative sample of Americans? Or right, and you have to decolonize the business world. You have to decolonize that specific, not only that specific establishment, but all the office buildings around it that people are streaming in from, which then feeds to the educational system and so on and so forth.
So you published your book in June, so right at the cusp of all of this moment in American life. If you were publishing it, if you were finishing it now, what would you say about what we've just lived through, or would it change?
That's a great question, Ann. When the book was in galleys, and I thought, and COVID was happening, I was like, oh my God, no one's going to talk about a book. There's, there's a pandemic raging. And I went back and I read the chapter on healthcare. I was like, you know what? Everything that's happening falls within the physics of what I just described in this book a year ago. Because you're talking about foundational systems, you're talking about the physics, if you will, of the way the society works. And so the pandemic played out according to those physics. The one thing I didn't capture is, and you know this, when you write a book, you want it to have some staying power. So you're not trying to glom onto every single thing in the news cycle or in the zeitgeist, but write things that are illuminative or representative of larger phenomena. But one thing that I didn't talk about at length were the protests, which are only then starting to happen. I didn't know that they have the staying power that they have had, which I'm just heartened to see. And they're still finding proper voice and form and shape, because if you like, police violence is one form of enforcing race, but it happens at economic sites, it happens at legislative sites, at educational sites, at personal and interpersonal sites, and happens in the environment. So all of these things are important, and like, well, it's good that we're starting here because that is the most egregious, violent representation. But you want those protests to stay along and mature to the point where it's no longer simply about the passion and the reaction to, hey, a cop shot someone, and that becomes the trigger for the protest, but against all of these conditions.
Yeah, and how it develops concrete rather than theatrical next steps, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
I wanted to ask you, because I was so struck by it. You wrote this great piece about Gail Jones and now it's escaping me. Was it the Atlantic or Harper's?
It was the Atlantic.
The
It was
Atlantic.
the editor of the Atlantic, yeah.
And kind of an amazing character. And I just wondered if would you like to tell us a little bit about how you came to write about her and how maybe she fits into this story?
Okay, I will tell the truth on myself. I hadn't read Gail Jones. I had not read Gail, and people had told me to read Gail, and I hadn't read Gail. And one of my magazine editors said, "Oh, who are the Black writers who've not been properly acknowledged?" And I kind of scan. I have a lot of books, as I'm sure a lot of you do, and a lot of Africana, and I just kind of went through my library and pulling out things I'd read and things I hadn't read, and I was arrested by Jones. It's like, okay, Gail, right? Who's someone who has always had a meaning and has belonged to this canon of Black literature, the private canon among Black writers. And if you talk to write, especially women writers, are like, yeah, Gail Jones. Everybody knows Gail Jones, and but I hadn't read her properly, right? No more than like the sort of like the skimming that you do for a survey class in college. And I started reading, and I was like, oh yeah, Gail Jones. And then I gave a few more names, and since, well, will you write a full piece on Gail Jones? Like, oh man, now I got to read everything Gail's written. I've got to read everything everybody's written about Gail, and this is gonna be a major undertaking. And the COVID's happening. I'm feeling kind of lazy, but I did it. I did it, and I read all of but I read all of Jones. And the reason the essay, I think, works is because I was discovering, as I was thinking, one of the things, the remarkable thing about Jones is she's right on top of it. If she were, I mean, she's alive, but if she were still working, she'd be way past everybody. And the people who I think are at the very, very head of the class, the most sophisticated thinkers, are just where Gail was in the 70s when she was writing those books. And she has, as I think all of the best Black writers have, they theorize themselves. And so Gail has theorized a literature and a view of literature and the past from Chaucer really up to Gail Jones that encompasses the ways she grew up, very different than the ways Chaucer grew up, but more importantly, very differently than what we're told what Chaucer is supposed to mean, that are foundational to the thoughts of the Black arts movement. And even now, we're still reading books about slavery, celebrating them for being so remarkable, so timely, so necessary. Gail was one of the inventors of that. She really was. And if you look at her influence, she was never the most popular writer, but she was formidable. And she's the kind of writer, it sounds like a cliche, that other writers read. And if you don't believe me, read anything Toni Morrison wrote after she read Gail Jones, and there you will find the receipts. So no, Gail's a phenomenon.
That really brings me to the question I wanted to ask about book spaces and book culture and how we integrate our little world. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot at Book Post is I've been seeing bookstores, especially as they're threatened and book culture becomes more and more kind of the property of monopoly or less accessible to people, how bookstores offer this point of access to people who are walking down the street or people in the neighborhood, the way that libraries also have been in many people's lives. And so I think about how booksellers think about how they seem accessible to people, or feel like accessible places or feel like exclusive places. And I heard this extraordinary conversation once between a white bookseller and a Black intellectual talking about diversifying bookselling. And the white bookseller was talking all about basically educating the white customers in being not racist. And the Black intellectual was like, how about a bookstore for Black people, for Black readers? You know, not all your readers need to be educated not to be racists. Um, so when you think about like the kinds of environments that we are in that have been overwhelmingly white, of course, you know, we need to diversify the upper echelons of publishing and and do all this kind of corporate work. But in our kind of internal book spaces, do you feel like there are white spaces and there are ways that we need to be more, you know, should the bookshelf have more Gail Jones?
I mean, every shelf should have Gail Jones, but and it's not just Gail. I can give you 10, right? I can name 10 writers from that generation, 5 if I'm applying my most rigorous standards. 5 writers who are canonical and going to be canonical once history has done its editorial work. I think the conversation that you just shared with us, they're both right, right? And people, this is me being generous, people, people are where they are. And everybody has to learn things at different times. You can, I mean, one of the things that I always try to remember is that I'm a limited being, and we're all limited beings, and I approach that with a sense of humility about my own ignorance and not arrogance, and to say like, oh, Calvin, you've done this and this and this, or you right, and so you're an expert on X, Y, and Z. The thing about America, about everyone in America, about the ways we're educated, about our cultural spaces, is they're produced by colonialism. Full stop. You can go to a great school in this country, be otherwise educated, know nothing of Black literature. You can or only have a sort of surface awareness of it. You then take that, right, that demi-ignorance into the world, and you can be a successful business owner who thinks you know certain things. Now, we all know bookshops face economic realities, and you're trying to locate yourself where you have this presumably or allegedly educated clientele who can support a small business. And like everything else, is a balancing act, right? And some of those questions become, well, what do you as the bookstore owner really know? I
Mm.
was in my local, and who are you hiring? So those are just practical things. And I was in my local bookshop. It's a very well regarded shop, and a woman comes in and she says to the clerks, "I'm looking for a Civil War book." And the clerk starts going through the list, and she's like, "Well, I don't really know. There's some stuff you know, you gotta read Race and Reunion. You
Mhm.
got it right, and you gotta. This is just foundational. This isn't something obscure. I think, and as I go read the Douglas biography, and these are both David Blight books, and you're like, these aren't obscure. Blight won a Pulitzer Prize for these books, but if you happen to have employed people who don't have subject matter knowledge or awareness or interest, then you're extending a colonial mind, you're extending a point of view, because as a bookseller, as any kind of cultural worker, right, as an editor, as a journalist, you're framing certain narratives and points of view. And you're often not aware of the ways that you're doing it. And so if you're a bookstore in a majority white space, you're thinking, oh, right, you're thinking like, hey, I'm a half step ahead of these customers who are just coming in and they've got like kid schmear all over them, and they just and I get it, right? That's real. And this person wants something for where they're at. They might not want to read Fanon. They might not be ready for Fanon. They may need Fanon. If right, you may need to go to the source to understand these things, because right, there are those things that are original and we call them canonical, right? Those things that endure. And then there are those things, and this is what I think we are in a lot of our popular conversation, many reasons because of commercial forces. And then you have a derivative of that, right? First, it's radical, and then it's institutionalized in academia. And then you get, right, and so hopefully that's still at a pretty high standard. And then you get the derivatives of that and the popularizations of that. And so you've lost a lot of the integrity, right? It's like a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox. Remember those? And it fades a bit every time. And so to speak about what the work of bookstores properly is, depends on the store, depends on, because everyone has their own point of view. And some people are like, yeah, I just really like books. I can't wait for the next Twilight. I'm like, okay, that's cool. That's why they make a bazillion books every year. So you have all these choices. But if you're really asking yourself, how do I work as, the word curator is overused, but as a servant of what people are trying to learn. Well, you've got to be educated yourself. You've got to hire people who are educated. You've got to meet folks, I think, where they are. And sometimes it's not that different from teaching, but it presumes a highly educated workforce inside that bookstore. And then the question of, do we need to, and I don't want to be long-winded about this, but do we need to educate white people in being anti-racist, or do we need to serve Black people who might be looking for a stronger kind of medicine? You got to do both.
Do you think that, is there a tension between, having the table of Black writers and having the Black writers mixed in, alongside Don DeLillo and, Marilyn Robinson?
Yeah.
I remember, didn't you tweet once that annoyance that your book had been in a window for its 1 week of, of racial justice, and then it was out of the window? I mean, it should also be on the table for politics today, or, American life.
All right, Ann. I'm going to expose myself a little bit, right? They're bookstores and they're bookstores. And when you ask yourself how, right? And so that's someone who's following a trend. Oh, there's a list. I need to put these 10 books in the window, so if there's a riot, nobody busts out my glass. And which, let's face it, was a little bit of what all that was. And right, you're trying to be current. It's fashion. It comes and goes. No real commitment. And just like there are fashions in reading, and there's real commitment to it. And you've read a lot of books, you see some of the conversation between them, and you know how to file them. And right, and you've got the table up front, or you've got the new release table, you've got the tables that the publishers pay for, you've got the tables that the folks in the store likes. And they're all, I mean, I want to be in both places, frankly, because you're trying to reach. But this goes back to what I was saying. Let's look, we live in such a segregated society, and knowledge is segregated, and our cultural spaces are segregated. And so if you're walking in the store and maybe it's not where you usually shop, it can feel welcoming to have that table there. But if I walk into the store, I want my book to be on that shelf. I want to know that my book's going to be on the shelf for, for years to come. Now, that something that's just like, oh, how's the publisher framed the book? How's the bookseller read the book or understood the book? It's like everything else. In the end, we're betting on history as writers, as thinkers. But if you are framing the cultural conversation for people and you're trying to be intentional about it and trying to be thoughtful about it, you look out and you look at your community and you think about your customers, like, okay, well, this is a kind of fly by night book, and this is right. Can you see the difference among these books, or is your right, or is your vision so colored? All you see is like there are 10 black guys who've got books out, or 10 black folks, and we're just going to put them all in the window together. And I can tell you, when you get those 10 people together, half of them want to kill each other because they don't agree. And they're talking about different things and have different points of view. So you can't reduce that, which is what race does. It reduces everything to the capsule of race. So it's both it's totalitizing, but also it's incomplete. It's completely incomplete. It doesn't capture the nuances.
What are the other books? And I know we're supposed to move on to our questions, but I'll just ask you this one last one. If you were making the kind of the syllabus of reading your book, what are the books you would want people to read along with it?
Mm, 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 mm. That's a great question. I mean, I think you have to. So when you write a book like this, you need 100 sources. Some of them are primary sources in text of the books that helped me think about early America. De Tocqueville was indispensable because no one ever talks about these 2 chapters on race in America, where Tocqueville doesn't know what he's looking at. And it's so precise and such a rigorous, discerning observer until he gets to race. But one of the things that he says about race that I found deeply meaningful was these people have 2 choices. They can come together or they can go their own ways. There's no other if, ands, or buts about it. And I think there's still a lot of waffling between the 2. And I'm just thinking about Du Bois, always Du Bois. I read all of Blight, and I was reviewing for you the Frederick Douglass biography as I was writing the Civil War, and that was illuminative, both for all those things that Blight gets immensely right, and for those little spaces, and they're small and they're subtle, that he doesn't quite have the feel for. There's nothing wrong with that. None of us have feels for everything, but that was amazing to understand better the sophistication of Douglas's thought and observations. Right, and it's not just like some guy with a paragraph in February. And Katznelson's book, When Integration Was White, which he's talking about these like the big programs, things like Social Security and the GI Bill, and the ways that European immigrants were integrated into Americanness, always at the sake of Black Americans, right? In many cases, right, Black people were not only excluded, but and with this David Blight's going out, he's talking about the social ways that you create Americanness. And so, and David doesn't put it as crudely as I paraphrase it, but you go to a theater and everything on the stage is a minstrel show and everybody in the audience is white, right? And these images of minstrelity that have been created in the antebellum South that become the most popular entertainment nationally. You go to a ballpark, right? It's like, hey, this is an American thing to do. We're going to participate in this pastoral pastime and this dream of America, but black people can't play, right? Because you're watching a segregated league. And so as they're having their minds filled with this, or being inculcated into it as they're being lifted into the middle class. And then you come a generation or two generations later, and people say, well, my grandparents worked hard and this isn't my fault. And it's like, well, no, there was a hand up. And the price of that, of all that legislation, was senators saying, to Roosevelt, you can't, the Eisenhower's like, you can't have that if Black people can participate. So from Social Security to, like we talk about, redlining, but this permeates all of these social safety networks and all of these, right, to the GI Bill and all, and like into land grant universities. It permeates the creation of the American middle class. And so what do you have? You take these people who don't know about race and you make them American, and you help them, right, you help them improve their lots in life with this idea that it is white. So, right, so Katznelson and Blight on that. I'm thinking, just going forward, I mean, you have to read the Constitution. You just do, because it is, people talk about Jefferson's prose and its beauty. It's a great writer or a lawyer. What's brilliant about it are the ways that they craft this compromise, the ways that they construct this thing that they don't want and that they want to live with, including the seeds of its demise. So, right, and those are the meaningful things. I use a lot of documentary text, if you will, for this. And I went back and I looked at, as I do when I'm writing my novels, I listen to a bunch of old music, watch a bunch of old speeches and clips, just trying to feel my way into each era that I was talking about, and the subtleties, right, and to enliven and invigorate. I found this little scene footage of King, and this little scene footage of, there's an interview 8 months before King died that never aired in color on NBC, and there's some footage of Baldwin that the Canadian Broadcasting Service Corporation had, and just going into these nooks and crannies of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's my
I
canon.
got a question
Everything.
here. Can you speak about the difference between the integration, which is yet to come, and the desegregation that has been practiced so far?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Desegregation is reactive, as are a lot of our conversations. And desegregation says, desegregation is the sort of, if it's a spectrum, it's the beginning of the spectrum, right? Desegregate the schools. It means knock down Jim Crow laws. And you can knock down Jim Crow laws, then everything just morphs, and right, the system of race, which is so, I call it a virus, and it's so brilliant. It kind of takes like, oh, we can't have legal segregation, but we can all move out of town. We can have charter schools. We can put these little poison pills in federal legislation that say you can't use federal funds for things like busing, which by the way worked. And integration says, no, this is an active process. You have to look around at all these spaces and say, we have to actively integrate them, because it's not going to happen on its own. Or if it does, it'll happen at such a slow pace. It'll take hundreds of years on its own. And every step of the way, you're going to be fighting the same fights that we're fighting right now. That people, everything that the Republicans say is, I don't want to say it's all in response to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But if you look at those things that are central to their identities and their platforms and their actions, right? Not the words, but the actions, they're hell-bent on turning back voting rights because the Black electorate is reliably liberal, and liberals aren't reliably progressive, but they don't want Black folks to vote. And they hated it when the Civil Rights Act, right, sent federal watchers, as they hated it when there were Union troops in the Confederacy, and everything was about getting rid of that so they can have their way again and oppress people. The education, they're still filing lawsuits against schools or private universities who give any sort of tip because of race. They're still filing lawsuits against that. Housing, and that provision was never enforced, but that's what Donald Trump and Fred Trump were sued for. We don't want Black people in our buildings. And job creation, and as recently as the 80s or 90s, as recently in the 90s, people talk about affirmative action, and it was clear, and affirmative action worked. You saw the greatest increase in the African American middle class in the country's history, and it was attacked. You can't say affirmative action anymore, right? It's too poisonous. But you've got to talk about the real material harm of colonialism. I call it colonialism because I see it as of a piece with other places in the British Empire, at least, and I mean other European empires, but specifically the British, and the ways that race works here. It's not that hard to understand. And it worked this way in India, it worked this way in Nigeria, it worked this way in Australia, right, with some slight variance from location to location. And you're trying to, and it still works that way, and you're trying to deconstruct those systems. I'm trying to understand them, not trying to make a kinder, gentler colonialism, trying to deconstruct it. Integration is the most direct line and path, and it's threatening. It's threatening to people because people say, like, well, I'm willing to give something up. I'm willing to help the Black folks or give something up so that Black people can get ahead. And like, except when we talk about Mexicans and Central Americans, again, they're Native Americans from the Spanish-speaking world. It's only in these cases that we see this country as a zero-sum game. That any gain by Black America is a loss for white America. That's colonial. As opposed to, if you had a boatload of people come over from war-torn Ukraine or Slovenia, you're like, oh, well, we want to integrate them into the American dream, and you're happy when they achieve. It's not a threat. Mm-hmm. And you're not thinking, oh, I have to save them. Like, I have to help because I have the wherewithal to help, to give, and helping means giving them, a fair shot, a square deal. With Black people, you've made sure they don't have that. And this is the difference between desegregation and integration, because you don't realize how heavy the historical foot, the institutional foot upon Black America has been in this country. And you say, well, I didn't create it, but we live inside of it. And we've been produced by it. And so you ask, how do I stop? Like, how do I produce? Like, okay, I'm a product of this. We're all products of this. How do I produce something new? That's an active question.
I really recommend, if you're not looking at the chat, Patricia's doing an amazing job here of footnoting everything that Calvin is saying. You can buy all of the books he's mentioned. And so here are two questions that are not related to each other at all, but I'm going to give you both of them and you can try to interweave them together. This one is the closest. Someone asked, Kendi talks about assimilation. How is that different from integration? And then there's a question about Baldwin, which you can get to later.
Okay. I mean, assimilation's it's an easy one. They try to assimilate folks in Australia, New Zealand. Assimilation means taking away my culture and making me live yours, taking away my dreams and giving me yours. Assimilation is an erasure. Integration is equal respect. And in a country where so much of American society has already been shaped by Black culture, where there is, right, we live adjacent to each other now, not together. And integration means you're gonna have to live together. Now you can, right, or at least the conditions to do so have to exist. If right, if we all have a fair shot, an equal shot, and we decide what we really want is to rip each other's face off, that's fine. That's a choice of free folk. But assimilation is forced one way.
And so we have someone who is asking about James Baldwin and if he was an influence.
That's
No,
my
not at all.
that's my I mean, I'll tell you my Baldwin story, and it was, I think I was 11 or 12, and it was my fifth grade teacher. So this is the summer I became a reader. My fifth grade teacher's, it was like the end of the school year, and she's like, "All right, like who can read 100 books this summer?" And I kind of, I was a pretty adept reader already, and I read my way through, right, the kid stuff and the YA stuff, and so right by August, you're over Encyclopedia Brown, Beverly Cleary, and all that stuff, and in the adult section. And there were just two books. I took The Stranger by Camus, and I took Baldwin's Go Tell Them the Mountain. That was my first exposure to Baldwin. And those books messed me up. They were, I mean, I can still remember the physical hotness from the first time I read Baldwin. And Camus I didn't understand at all, and read him again later in French, and I got a little more understanding, and read him again during this epidemic, and I finally got him. But Baldwin, so if you, and then I like read Baldwin in college, and like came into contact with a lot of people who had known Baldwin, and so you get the Apocrypha as well, and you feel this real connection, like this direct line of transmission from him to you. One of the amazing things about Baldwin, I think people still aren't getting, is how complicated he is. And we think of him and we see him as this voice for racial justice. We keep talking, and we talk about The Fire Next Time. That's the book everyone's taken to. It was a book that, I'm not going to tell tales out of school, but the last thing Baldwin wanted to do was perform race for white America. And if you look at the novels, he's using, after Go Tell It in the Mountain, he's using every move he has to try to escape being pigeonholed and told who he must be, because he's writing from this deep, complex fullness and interior awareness. But the society wants to trap him. It's like, well, no, Jimmy, you're a Black writer, and the civil rights movement comes along, and it's, you got to do this, you got to do this, and Baldwin's concerned with all the complexity in the world. And when you talk about race in America, well, that's child's play. It is simple in its desires, its goals, in its organizations, but it's also pernicious, right? You don't have to, I mean, one of the things I say in this book is, I don't want to write about race anymore because we know all there is to know about race. A, we invented it, but B, we've measured it. We've got policy studies. We can tell you its atomic weight. We can tell you like the Big Bang of race. I'm talking about integration. and what it means to live in a fully fair and equal society. Because if you don't have a goal in mind, you're never going to get there. And you're going to sit there talking about how can I be anti-racist? That's reactive. You're chasing, like you got to protest every time the police kill somebody. That's reactive. What's the active goal and vision? That's what illuminates me or animates me.
Well, that seems like a thrilling crescendo. I think maybe we're there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Malaprops. This is really, the chat is really a blast. I have to say, like, it's a footnoted version.
You all made it easy to do. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much for that, Patrick.
And thank you, guests. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And
Thank you, Ann, for inviting me, and Malaprops, and for everyone for enduring another Zoom event.
Thank you both so much. And you had mentioned previously, bear with me, I'm just gonna remove the spotlight, like literally make it a little more relaxed for y'all. So there you go. And you had mentioned offering subscriptions potentially if people wanted to give their email.
I didn't want to undercut the pitch from Malaprop.
You know, and I don't either, but I'm also fine with, you know, if you want to invite people to get it. Yeah, the first hit's free.
We have this policy always with our partner bookstores. If you spend $100 there, we'll give you a 3-month subscription, which is a great loping gulp, a great, expansive horizon of book post. But I also, when people come to events, I offer them a smaller 1-month subscription just for coming to the event. So if you would like to get a little tiny subscription, read our new Joy Williams piece, read Calvin's 2 pieces, just put your email in the chat and we'll be happy to send you one.
Excellent. Thank you.
This is amazing, by the way. Ann is very modest, but again, she's just has a brilliant mind and amazing contributors writing about really consequential books. So it's worth having.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I just got the book post, and I didn't start reading J.M. I'm going to say his name wrong. Ketsey. Ketsey, thank you. Until just a few years ago, and was really struck. And so, yeah, I really appreciated the most recent book post that landed in my inbox.
The third of these Jesus books came out, I think, in the spring or something. And I read one of them and found it very puzzling. And they're very enigmatic. Mm-hmm. And it just struck me that they would appeal to Joy Williams, who's written some about on biblical themes or about religion, but in a very mysterious way. And they got to her. So this is an amazing piece. I shouldn't go on and on about it, but I really recommend my current one. And I have other great ones coming up. And soon, Calvin, I'm gonna have to reel you in for another review.
I'll be there.
All right.
So for the folks who are still here, I just want to say thank you again to both of you. Calvin, it's such a pleasure to meet you, and I would happily just sit and listen to you talk for some time longer, but we will be respectful of everyone's time.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah.
When I come in Nashville, I'll be sure to stop in.
Please do, and thank you so much for the work on. For your work in general, but this work in particular, which I think adds so much to the conversation that we're having, and of course the conversations that we need to have and need to continue to have, this honest reconciliation around race and how we, I was going to say how we contend with it, but mostly how we've avoided contending with it up until now, and colonialism. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
And Anne, thank you for the great questions and for Book Post's partnership with Malaprop's and for being indie bookstore boosters. We really appreciate it. And folks, wherever you are, just support your local indie where you are. We need you, we love to have you, but they also need you, and seek them out. Patricia also posted a link to Black-owned bookstores across the country. And if you have a Black-owned bookstore near you in particular, I think that's patronize them as well. But so we just appreciate you all so much, and thank you. Hope you have a wonderful evening and stay safe and well. I'm going to also go ahead. This is just me. Vote, please, if you haven't already. I'm not speaking for.
I voted.
Yeah.
Done.
Just going to put that out there. Please vote. All right. Good night, everybody.
Ready?